where we left off, I just got into hormones, talking about some of the general aspects of hormones and general qualities. Went over different chemical natures of the hormones, being steroid or amino acid derivative, etc. And also the particular types of signal transduction pathways that they are involved with. And so I went through, last thing I went through is this G protein linked system, where the secondary messenger on the inside that sets everything in place is cyclic AMP. Of course, the first messenger is the stimulatory hormone, right? And so this leads to a cascade of events that changes the activity of the cell. All right, so these second messengers, okay? So STP here stands for signal transduction pathway. And so that is what is induced by the hormone that on the outside, secondary messenger on the cytoplasmic side, usually is cyclic AMP if it's a G-linked protein. However, that's not the only type of secondary messenger that is produced through G protein linked receptors. There's others that are real important. For example, calcium. Calcium is real reactive in a lot of things inside the cell. And we'll come across some cases where calcium is playing a role, but is sometimes instead of cyclic AMP, calcium can be second messenger. Sometimes there's something called diacyl glycerol and adenosine triphosphate. These things are sometimes also secondary messengers. I'm not going to go into any details about what they do. Just want the generalities here of what's going on. All right, so usually all these secondary messengers, they are activating proteins that are already there. So it's not influencing transcription, translation, but proteins that are already there that are in high frequency use. They turned on, turned off, turned on, turned off to respond to very rapid changes in the cell. And so these are the cascades. Now, why a signal, why a cascade? This amplifies the signal in a very, very short period of time. And I'll just give you an example on the next slide here, how this works. And of course, these are always short-term responses. Quick responses usually do not last very long. Okay, an example here is with epinephrine and its effect on glucose, okay, stores from the liver. Okay, because the liver stores glycogen, and this is a stress hormone, okay, acute stress. And so one of the things that it has to do is stimulate the liver cells to start breaking down glycogen and release glucose, okay? So if we have just one molecule, epinephrine binds to the G-linked receptor, that activates an inactive G protein. It's now active, and that one receptor can amplify the signal here, and it isn't a one-to-one relationship. So just because one hormone binds to one receptor, that one receptor may be associated with tens of G proteins, and so it activates more. Now I just made up these numbers here just to show you that they're increasing. And then that G protein, usually it's a one-to-one relationship here, that the G protein binds to an inactive adenylate cyclase, which activates that. And that's no change in amplification here because it's a one G protein, one adenylate cyclase. But the adenylate cyclase converts a lot of ATP over, much more than what I have here. Okay, as I said, I just made up these numbers showing that so far just one hormone has led to this high of a response with the cyclic AMP. Then of course cyclic AMP, this is one-to-one relationship as well. It binds to the inactive protein kinase A and leading to, in this case, this is a type of C AMP dependent protein kinase. but in the livers, it's specifically something called protein kinase A. And that is now active protein kinase A, which then activates an inactive enzyme called phosphorylase kinase. And one of them can activate, several, maybe 1,000 or so. And so the numbers are going up, and then the active phosphorylase kinase will activate an inactive glycogen phosphorylase, which is the main thing that we're doing. But by this time now, we have real high numbers of this activated compared to just one hormone that bound, okay? And therefore, and this takes just a split second to happen, okay? It's real fast, all right, real fast. So we get this amplification real quickly, and so that's this active glycogen phosphorylase that is breaking glycogen down into glucose 1-phosphate. Okay, let's just illustrate. Now, I don't expect you to memorize all of this, okay? I just want you to know the principle here that I'm talking about. What is the significance of these phosphorylation cascades? Is that in a very short period of time, we can build up high numbers of the final actor that does the real business here. Okay? All right. So those are the principles. Now, summarize. This is just only a summary of everything. Okay, so the steroid types of hormones, they're receptors inside the cell. And what they do is that they bind to their receptor. Together with their receptor, they are transcription factors. And they bind to either enhancers or silencers that control the activity of genes and either upregulate particular suites of genes, downregulate other suites of genes, but it changes gene expression, okay? And therefore the response is usually relatively slow, okay? Because it takes some time for transcription and translation, post-translational modification of the proteins to take place. It's not instantaneous, and therefore there's a little bit of a delay. On the other hand, those that are hydrophilic, usually amino acid derivatives, short peptides, glycoproteins, and so forth, they change the activity in the cell by binding to an external receptor. So it's actually a transmembrane receptor in the plasma membrane. But the binding site for the hormone is on the outside of the cell, and therefore the hormone does not pass into the cell unlike steroid hormones do. And what we get is a signal transduction pathway through the receptor. With a G-protein linked receptors, there is a relay protein, namely the G protein, and then an effector that leads to the production of the secondary messenger. And this is altering not gene expression, it's altering the behavior of proteins that are already there, okay, turning them on. Usually this is very rapid and very, and generally relatively short-lived. All right, so now looking at the major endocrine glands. Now, these endocrine glands produce a large number of hormones, and we don't have time to discuss them all. We're just going to go over and look at the more important ones. But important parts here include hypothalamus. That's the base of the brain. It controls a lot of homeostatic properties inside of the cell or inside of the body. It has control over the major master gland, namely the anterior and posterior pituitary. Now, both of these are right next to each other, but they have different embryological origins. With regard, I believe that the anterior is of ectodermal origin, whereas the posterior is mesodermal origin. So they're different, but they're right next together. They're controlled, both of them are controlled by the hypothalamus, but in a different way, slightly different way. Other important glands here, the thyroid gland. I'm not going to talk about the pineal gland. It secretes melatonin, but I don't want to talk about it. It's just sort of a sleepy type of thing. Thyroid, parathyroid hormones, and adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla. In other words, the adrenal gland, which sits right on top of the kidney. Like the kidney has two major layers to it, the cortex and the medulla. That's the way it is also with the adrenal gland. And the cortex and medulla, they secrete different types of hormones. Then part of the pancreas, okay? Pancreas is an exocrine gland involved in digestion, but it has spots all throughout it that are called islets of Langerhans. And these are endocrine glands, okay? And they secrete insulin and glucagon. We'll talk about those. And then the testes and ovaries. How come every time this time of day? New York. I don't know anyone in New York. Anyway, the gonads. The gonads are also important hormone glands. Okay, so I'm going to go through these one by one. Hypothalamus. I already introduced the hypothalamus with control of the kidney. In the hypothalamus, there are modified neurons that are called neurosecretory cells. Neurosecretory cells, they produce the hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary does not produce any of its own hormones. All of them are made by these neurosecretory cells. They're released from the posterior pituitary, from the axons of the neurosecretory cells that happen to be there, right? And the two main hormones here, or about the hypothalamus, go back here. The anterior pituitary, however, still controlled by neurosecretory cells that are in the hypothalamus, but the anterior pituitary, those neurosecretory cells do not, they produce what are called releasing and inhibiting hormones that are released into the bloodstream and diffuse into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, however, makes a lot of its own hormones, but the hypothalamus still controls the release of those hormones that happen to be in the anterior pituitary. Okay? So those are called releasing factors and inhibiting factors, or releasing hormones, inhibiting hormones. So posterior pituitary, we've already come across this already once, antidiuretic hormone. Okay, and what is the, this is a peptide. I believe it's about 7 amino acids. You don't have to know that because I'm guessing right now. Something between 7 and 9. So it's not real big peptide, but it is a peptide. So what is the target? Specific.
Collecting them.
Collecting them, exactly. And what does it lead to?
Keeps you water.
How?
By bringing in solid.
No. How does it work? What action does the collecting duct cells do after being induced to do so by antidiuretic hormone? That leads to
bind the receptor G protein.
Yeah.
And then we'll, increase the blood volume by closing.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking for the exact mechanism. That's why is water then brought out, reabsorbed from the collecting duct?
You have to do something with the aquaporins.
Aquaporins. Okay, so it modifies the number of aquaporins that happens to be in the membrane, therefore allowing water to be, due to the salt gradient being pulled out and back into the bloodstream. So it's aquaporins. Aquaporins are real important. All right, another one. So I already said that. A second, it's also a peptide. This is called oxytocin. Oxytocin differs from antidiuretic hormone by just only 2 amino acids. But just only that little difference makes a big difference because it has totally different targets, totally different responses. So one of the targets is mammary glands in mammals, certain parts of the brain, and also the uterus during childbirth, okay? And what is the responses here? Oxytocin is very important during pregnancy, after, especially near childbirth time, to produce milk. And so it leads to the production of milk in the mammary glands. The brain, several places in the brain. So this is sort of the social, get close bonding type of hormone because it increases bonding emotional bonding, primarily between mother and baby, okay? But it also increases bonding between individual people, okay, friends, even between an owner and their pet, okay? When they're cuddling close together, the levels of oxytocin go up in the blood. They've been able to measure that. So it's sort of a bonding type of thing. You look to politicians, we really need to do that, give them a lot of it, all right? And another place would be uterus during childhood. What'd you say?
They'll start producing milk.
Yeah. Okay, uterus during childbirth. It induces contractions in what is called the endometrium, okay, the muscles of the uterus. And in fact, sometimes doctors, to induce a difficult pregnancy, they will inject the mother with oxytocin, okay, to bring that up. So and these are the only two hormones that are found in the posterior pituitary. All right, so milk production, bonding, muscle contractions, respectively. Anterior pituitary. It produces quite a few, and I'm only going to talk about some of them. One of them is, once again, it's a peptide, and this is called growth hormone. Very important in growing up. It has many targets in the body. It induces mitosis. It's very much involved with mitosis. So I'm not giving specific targets here, because it can affect during growth, muscle development and everything, but bone is real important here. Bone and cartilage in particular. Now what happens when you're growing with bone is that the long bones, like in your arm, humerus, femur, and so forth, is that, at the ends, it is bone, but then there is a zone of cartilage at each end. So there's a zone of cartilage and then bone down here where you're at the joint. Once you reach maturity, okay, so this is where the growth hormone is influencing it. It is really binding to these cartilage zones and leading to the buildup of cartilage, lengthening of the bone, and then that gets mineralized, okay? Once you reach maturity, these growth zones with cartilage, they are mineralized, so you no longer have cartilage there. You have cartilage here, okay, as at the joints, but not within the bone, the long bone itself. And that's where it stirs up everything. So it promotes growth. Now what happens if there's damage to the pituitary in a child before they've reached maturity, and there's an overproduction of this hormone, you get gigantism, okay? They will grow to very, very tall. All these people who are well over 7 foot tall or so have something wrong with their producing way too much growth hormone. Yes?
Didn't Robert Waldau have like a tumor somewhere then?
Usually, yes. And that's a part of the area that's very hard to get to, okay, underneath the brain without causing a whole lot of damage. So tumors, yes, very often do that. So this is an individual, I forgot what his name is. This is a normal height person. This guy's probably 6 foot tall, but this guy is about 9 foot tall. Usually giants like this don't live long, okay? They might live until their 30s or 40s, but they don't live a very long life because the heart has to pump blood over such long distances, and it really is hard on the heart. Now, if this happens under production, then you get dwarfism. Because what happens with dwarfism is that these bones, that cartilage growth area, that seals too early. It calcifies too early. And therefore, their arms, legs are incredibly short. This could be corrected for if the problem is caught early enough in childhood these days, because growth hormone is a product that human growth hormone can be produced by recombinant DNA technology. And so medicines have been produced like this. Now, what do I mean by that? Take the gene for growth hormone, splice it into bacteria, mass grow the bacteria, and the bacterium produce the growth hormone, and it's human growth hormone. And so injections can be given, and they'll grow normally, okay? However, if after maturity has been reached and something goes wrong with the pituitary, growth hormone goes up. It stimulates the growth of cartilage all over the body. and nose, any place where there's cartilage. And you have cartilage at most of your joints, and as that cartilage builds up, it becomes very hard to move those joints and very painful. And that's something called acromegaly. And I have a picture of someone who suffers from acromegaly, and the nose, since there's a lot of cartilage there, very big. Ears are big. Fingers, the joints, very difficult to move because it's very, very painful because of the buildup of the cartilage. Okay? Now, that's one important anterior pituitary gland or hormone. There's other hormones that are produced by the anterior pituitary that are called tropic hormones. A tropic hormone is a hormone that controls the release of hormones by other endocrine glands. And so it is a hormone that's controlling an endocrine gland, such as testes, ovaries, and so forth. And there's quite a few of those. Some of them we'll talk about. I'm not going to go into details on these, but they're going to be very, very important when we get into the next lecture on reproduction. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. You just need to know them as FSH and LH. I continue to say follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These are glycopeptides, and their targets are testes and ovaries. Both males and females produce both of these, but in males and females, their operation is slightly different, okay? And we'll postpone that till later. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. This is because why are these tropic hormones? Because they are controlling the testes and ovaries production of other hormones, okay? That's what makes them trophic. Thyroid stimulating hormone, it controls the release of the thyroid's hormones, and therefore it's a tropic hormone. So tropic here is the thyroid, stimulates the thyroid to release its type of hormones, which we'll get to momentarily. Okay, make sure everyone has that before I move on. Yes?
Quick question about
Acromegaly?
Yeah. Is it any place that has cartilage, or like do they?
Usually it's cartilage, because by that time it's not influencing the bone. Because your bones, because this is in an adult, okay? That's already after those cartilage areas at the ends of the long bones have already mineralized. Because that's where growth hormone would promote, first of all, the growth of cartilage, and then that cartilage would be transformed into bone, okay? But once those growth areas are gone, then all that this excess growth hormone can affect is just only areas where you have chondrocytes, okay? Because that's, more specifically, the target is the chondrocytes, okay? Okay, so this is just showing all of the hormones and their targets. We're not going to talk about them all, but this is the place, this is the hypothalamus, drawing of the hypothalamus, showing posterior pituitary. And as I said before, there's neurosecretory cells that their axons go all the way down into posterior pituitary, and they release from the axons, they release the hormones. On the other hand, with the anterior pituitary, these neurosecretory cells, they do not get out of the hypothalamus. And what we have here is a capillary bed. And so their axons release their releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone into a capillary bed. That capillary bed gets in, fuses together, and we have a portal vessel. Okay? Remember the hepatic portal vessel? This is a portal vessel too. Very short, because it just only goes from this capillary bed in the hypothalamus to a capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. And all these releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones, they're very specific for particular cell clusters that release and produce certain specific hormones. And there's quite a few of them here, okay? We're not going to look at all of them. Just only the ones I just mentioned, yes.
Are we gonna eventually have to know these pathways or anything?
Pathways?
I mean, not pathways, but like, just
Yeah, with the hormones, you're going to need to know where they're produced, how they're released, what the targets is, specific target, real specific target, and what is the response of the target. Okay? Yeah. Pathway, but they go through the blood. You want that too? We can do that. We like Netflix, don't we? Okay, so thyroid gland. That sits right up here, and of course, when you're doing the fetal pig, everyone wanted to see it. You'll get to see it when you remove those muscles, because it's sitting right just below the larynx, right, in your throat. And it produces actually several forms of thyroxine. I'm just going to mention one. Usually there's two different types of thyroxine. Thyroxine is a amino acid derivative. It comes from tyrosine. It's a modified tyrosine that requires iodine. Okay, to form thyroxine, you take tyrosine, and at certain places on the R group, you attach 1 or 2 iodine atoms, and that will make thyroxine. That's why iodine deficiency leads to something called gout, okay, because the gout is a swelling of the thyroid. It swells because it's trying to compensate for the lack of the ability to make thyroxine. And what does thyroxine do? It has many targets in the body, so I'm not giving something real specific there, but it regulates metabolic rate. Regulates, in other words, cellular respiration, the rate of cellular respiration. So if someone has low thyroxine output, they're usually very tired, fatigued, because the body isn't producing sufficient amounts of ATP, because this here is regulating the rate at which ATP happens to form. And if you, on the other hand, if it's like Dr. Barnby, two of you know Dr. Barnby, right? Okay, yeah, he's very all over the place, right? He has too much thyroxine, in my opinion. Okay, a joke. He and I are good friends. Okay, another hormone, okay, that is produced here in the thyroid gland is calcitonin. Calcitonin regulates calcium content in the blood. Calcium is plays several very important metabolic aspects, and we'll come across some of those. For example, during fertilization of an egg, calcium is a real important player for that to happen. For muscle contraction, calcium is very much involved. And for the release of neurotransmitters from neurons, calcium is involved. However, it has to be highly regulated. It could be very reactive if you have too much of it or too little of it. So it has to be very regulated in your blood. Sitting on top of the thyroid are 4 clusters of cells that are called the parathyroid gland. And so that's right on the surface of the thyroid in 4 different clusters. And it produces parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone is antagonistic to calcitonin. So here is one example now of an antagonistic hormone system that is regulating calcium concentration. So let's look at that a little bit deeper here. So what happens if calcium concentration in the blood gets too high, then it leads to the release of calcitonin. And the targets of calcitonin are bone, but let's get more specific. Osteoclast, particularly osteoclast, okay? Because what does osteoclast do? They build bone, right? And so this leads the osteoclast to take up the calcium, convert it into calcium carbonate, calcium phosphate, and deposit it in bone. Okay, so that is removing calcium from the blood and depositing in bone. Yes?
I thought osteoblast build up and osteoclast.
Osteoclast build bone, osteoblast. No, it's the other way around. Osteoblast, that's good. Okay, good. Osteoblast. They build the bone, osteoclast take it down. So osteoblast. Another place target is, okay, I have a kidney. Let's get more specific there. Distal tubules. Distal tubules. And what this leads to is it inhibits or lowers the reabsorption of calcium out of the filtrate. so that calcium is eliminated from the body if you have too much of it, okay? So how's it doing that? It's influencing calcium transporters, okay, and calcium channels. We have both. I haven't talked about it, but we have both. Calcium transporters and calcium channels, their activity is lowered so that the calcium stays in the urine. If on the other hand, there's too much of a decrease in calcium, that stimulates the release of parathyroid hormone. And parathyroid hormone has the exact same targets, but does exactly the opposite. Furthermore, okay, so here it is in bone target, but it is not osteoblast, but osteoclasts. That is the target, which induces them to break down calcium phosphate and release calcium ion into the blood, elevating it. Target also is the distal tubules, where it stimulates calcium transporters to reabsorb calcium from the filtrate, okay? Now there's another hormone here that's involved with parathyroid. Parathyroid hormone actually has to work synergistically with vitamin D. We call it a vitamin, but it's really a hormone. It's really a hormone. It's very much involved in calcium regulation. So it works together with parathyroid hormone, okay, to increase calcium in the blood. In fact, the way it works is that that's a steroid, okay? Vitamin D is derived from cholesterol. We make it in our skin as our cells interact with UV light as an energy source and converts it in the skin into one particular form of, really the name for that is called calciferol. And there's 3 different types of calciferol. What's made in the skin is inactive. And once it gets into the bloodstream to the kidneys, certain kidney cells turn it into the active form. And so then it's a hormone. It has an internal receptor, so it enters the cells, binds to the receptor, and it changes gene expression, okay? So how is that working up here in bone? Is that it's increasing the number of, stimulating the gene expression in the osteoblasts, whereas in the distal tubules, it's stimulating the production, transcription, translation of the calcium transporters, okay? It has a third target, and this is the epithelium in the duodenum, certain cells there, stimulating the production of calcium transporters that take in calcium from your food, okay? All these are tending to increase the calcium level in the blood. Okay? Another antagonistic pair of hormones. This time it's in the pancreas, the islets of Langerhans. They have 2 different types of clusters, one that contains cells. They contain types of cells that are called beta cells and alpha cells, and they're sort of scattered together within these islets of Langerhans tissues. So if you eat a meal, and of course, all that food, which includes a lot of glucose, it does go through the hepatic portal vessel to the liver, and most of it is taken out. However, not all of it is. So after a meal, your blood sugar can go up. Okay, it can go up, and if it reaches a certain level, then the beta cells are stimulated to release insulin. Okay, insulin, it binds to certain cells, mostly liver. Okay, that blood is coming to the liver, and so this also helps the liver, but also muscle cells and other cells in your body, stimulates them to insert a particular type of GLUT transporter into plasma membranes and take up the glucose. If it drops, skip a meal, and the blood sugar level drops, then that stimulates different class of cells, the alpha cells, and they release another type of hormone called glucagon. And glucagon has different targets, but particularly the liver, and it stimulates the liver to, it's very similar in its actions here to epinephrine under acute stress. Okay, it does very much the same thing. It has a signal transduction pathway that is very similar to that of epinephrine, leads to the breakdown of glycogen, release of glucose into the blood. There's other hormones that are involved in nutritional balance of your blood, and it gets very complicated, but this is all we need to go into. All right, so what happens if something in this system doesn't work and those cells don't take up glucose? Is that it increases in concentration in the blood, and this is called diabetes. Two different ways in which it can come about. One is insulin dependent, it's called type 1 diabetes. This is due to an autoimmune disease, we believe, most of the time. What happens is that immune cells in the body start attacking and destroying the beta cells. Your own body is destroying the beta cells, and as a consequence, you don't produce insulin, and as a result, glucose is not taken up at its very, very high level. That creates a lot of problems with circulation, and it damages the kidneys. One of the first signs of insulin or diabetes is finding sugar, glucose in the urine, because usually the proximal tubules take all that back in. But here, if the sugar is too high, that doesn't happen. And it can also affect the eyes, leading to blindness and amputation of limbs because the sugar just clogs up the system. So this can be corrected, however, by giving the person insulin injections, okay? But there's a second type, which is not dependent on insulin. And this here is starting to reach epidemic levels in many industrial countries. And this is type 2. Here, insulin doesn't play a role, okay? The insulin is just fine. What is wrong here is the receptor for insulin. The receptor for insulin doesn't bind to the insulin, doesn't recognize it. So this could be due to damage to the insulin receptor. But if the receptor doesn't respond, even if it doesn't matter if you have plenty of insulin, it doesn't take up, lead the cell to take up glucose. And this is mostly due to a lack of exercise, so and obesity. Okay, being overweight has led to this. Okay, and there's other hormones here that's also leading to this lowered responsiveness of the insulin receptor. Okay, all right, adrenal glands, the medulla part. This is the one that produces epinephrine. This is also called adrenaline. Okay, epinephrine, adrenaline, same thing, and norepinephrine. Both of them are similar to each other in their effects. They do have different receptors, and in fact, epinephrine, there's several different receptors that all will be affected by the very same hormone. All right, and this is released under acute stress, and I already went through a lot of targets for epinephrine. Okay, one of them is glycogen, or the liver, and skeletal muscle, breaking that down into glucose. Adipose cells happen to be a target. That leads to the release of fatty acids to increase the energy supply circulating in the blood for the muscles to respond to. The heart is also subject to epinephrine, increases stroke volume and also heart rate. Bronchioles, I haven't mentioned this before. Now, some of these I've already given you the targets, but here I didn't mention that earlier. The smooth muscle in the bronchioles, it leads them to dilate. Now, why does that make sense? For responding to acute stress. The bronchioles in the lung get wider. More oxygen, okay? Because we need the oxygen for cellular respiration. So it increases the ability of the lungs to bring in oxygen. And I already mentioned the smooth muscle and going to the skin, digestive system, it vasoconstricts, shunning the blood away from the skin, shunning the blood away from the digestive system. The food can wait. There's another emergency here. And smooth muscle in arteries going to brain, heart, and skeletal muscle, they increase. vasodilator, because this is where you need the blood to go, so that the brain and heart and skeletal muscle can perform. Okay, so those are stress hormones. We refer to that as, acute stress. Acute stress, when you say acute versus chronic, those are two terms that are often used. Acute means it's immediate, but not long-lasting. Usually not long-lasting. Chronic is it's there and it goes on and on and on and on, okay, for a long time. Adrenal cortex. It produces, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Both of those are, I believe they're modified amino acids, okay? But don't quote me on them. Nonetheless, they're hydrophilic. For the cortex, they produce steroids, okay? So one of these is a class, and I'm just getting into classes of these hormones, namely corticosteroids. And they're broken into two different groups. There is something called the mineralocorticoids, which there are several of them, one of which is aldosterone. We've already talked about that, okay? So its target is the distal tubules in the kidney, and it influences gene expression for sodium potassium ATPases. Therefore, it leads to the increase of sodium uptake, and water follows. But there's also things that are related to energy balance in the body. These are glucocorticoids. Some of these are called, glucocorticoids are, some of them are long-term stress hormones, okay? And there's, as I said, these are classes because there's quite a few of them. I just want to talk about one particular type of glucocorticoid that, some of these are anti-inflammatory. In fact, if you're having inflammation, a lot of time that is chronic, they often will give you shots of steroids. These are glucocorticoids because they do reduce inflammation, but they're also related to metabolism, right? So one of these I'd like to put out, okay, I'll come to that in a moment, is for starvation. Okay, this is something that humans in the past have faced very often. So under starvation conditions, there's one particular type of glucocorticoid that has several targets. One of these happens to be the liver, and because what has happened here is, of course, under starvation is you don't have glucose anymore. Okay, you used up the carbohydrate reserves, you've used up a lot of the fatty acid reserves, now you're starting to burn proteins, and that's getting to be dangerous. Even when you're in the phase where you're mostly burning fat instead of glucose, there are certain tissues, such as the brain and some parts of the heart, that their energy supply has to be glucose. So the brain has to have glucose. It doesn't operate with fatty acids, cannot operate with amino acids, it has to have glucose. And therefore, one of the things here with the glucocorticoids is that it induces a particular pathway by which certain amino acids, a lot of times it's tyrosine, is, that thing got wet, a pathway that will convert amino acids into glucose, okay? That's called amyloglucogenesis, okay? So this is taking an amino acid, such as tyrosine, and opening up a pathway to produce glucose so that the brain still has glucose, even though you're not getting any carbohydrates in the diet. Now, this creates a problem, too, in that you have glucose, other cells can take it up. And so what this glucocorticoid does is also induces insulin resistance. And so it affects the insulin receptor on certain types of cells, not neurons, on certain types of cells. Because if you're using, and this is expensive, energy expensive pathway, it doesn't release energy, you're putting energy into it in order to do it, but you need the glucose for the brain. But then if you're making this precious glucose, you don't want skeletal muscle taking it up and using it. Skeletal muscle can live on the fatty acids, that can live on the proteins. But so this affects the insulin receptor so that that is not taken up under this type of long-term stress. Okay, and then there are certain types of sex hormones, including androgens and estrogens that are produced here. Now, most of the androgens and estrogens are produced by the gonads, okay, the testes, ovaries, but we still have some sex hormones that are produced in the cortex of the adrenal gland as well. Which brings us to the gonads, which is going to be our next topic. They produce steroid hormones. A lot of these are estrogens, androgens. The most important androgen is testosterone and dihydroxytestosterone. We'll come back to that when we get into looking at the gonads. Okay? So those are all of the hormone systems, I believe. Yeah, so these things, these particular hormones in the gonads, they influence the growth and development of the reproductive system and also its continuous operation. What we'll find is that, yeah, it's the hormones are, and both estrogens and androgens are produced in both males and females. They produce them in different quantities, however. Okay, and that does also influence reproductive cycles in most animals. Okay, most animals, unlike humans, are not sexually receptive all year round. They have very specific mating seasons, and these sex hormones are very important for determining when those mating seasons occur. Okay, so this is a little bit different from humans. All right, any questions? Any slide you want to go back to? Because now we're going to go into reproduction and look more closely at these particular types of hormones. Yes?
How in slide 23.
Slide 23?
Yeah, I actually have a question. So,
Okay, let me go back to slide 23 so I can see what it is.
it was vitamin D. You said that enter cells change gene expression, which increase the number of stimulation of gene expression in osteoblasts. Like, how does it increase the numbers of stimulation?
Well, it's a complicated little pathway because a lot of times what these osteoblasts, osteoclasts, they're interchangeable, but they're expressing different proteins, different genes, and so the vitamin D is switching the gene expression and changing osteoclast and osteoblast. So the cell types change their identity. Yeah, and that involves, when you do any sort of change like that, you know, it involves changing the proteins on the inside, okay, changing the behavior of the cell, and that always involves a change in gene expression. Okay, and you have a?
Do hormones play a role in someone getting migraine?
With migraines, to my knowledge, no. That's very interesting because I just had one yesterday. Okay, I have migraines. In fact, they started maybe about 10 years ago, and they were pretty frequent, but they're not real heavy. They eventually disappeared. I hadn't had them for something like 3 years now. Until maybe 3 weeks ago, I had one, and then yesterday. They start with an aura. You know, I can't see. Okay, there was one of them that the last one from had a big gap. Started with instead of an aura, visual aura, it was tingling all through my body, like a stroke. You know, and that was something. So they had to do all these tests. But get back to your question. Okay, hormones don't play a role. What is really plays a role, they're not real sure, but magnesium and maybe the vitamin D. On both occasions, I was deficient, or I had too low levels of vitamin D. So I started taking